Hey, welcome to Gold's Garage. So this is episode 3 on DIY building a 350 engine on a budget. And Mike Kimball and I are working this together. This is Mike's engine. And it started off to be, the project definition was to build 375 horsepower for $2,500. And if you watch that, we made that about a week ago when we were just getting started. We made another one a few days ago. And we actually changed the definition to make 375 horsepower for $2,000. So we've actually reduced the budget. And for the details of how we did that, I had Mike in the last video. You're going to have to watch that and find out, and we'll talk about it more later. But what I'm going to try to do today is jam as many things, facts that are helpful to you in the shortest possible time. So I got this mocked up as much as I can. We're going to demonstrate doing some things and showing you or telling you how we did certain things. But a couple of points I have to make. So DIY, do it yourself. So what's the motivation to do that? You know, I started at a young age being a DIY guy because I couldn't afford to pay anybody to do it. I certainly would have been racing a Z28 at 19 or 20 years old if I had to pay anybody to do anything. So, but I'm still a DIY guy and always will be. There's two reasons you want to do that. One is save money, which is obvious. The other is a thing I call psychic income. And that's the satisfaction that you get knowing that you did it yourself. You start up your engine and it runs and performs well. You know all about it. You know every detail inside of it because you did it, or you did as much of it at least as you could yourself. And that's as valuable, I think, as saving the money. So I'm going to move on to a whole bunch of things. I'm at a stage now. I'm going to turn it over. The crankshaft's in. One of the things Mike talked about in the last video was preparing the block, and one thing we didn't cover is preparing the bolt holes for being threaded. And it's really important, especially on Chevrolet small blocks, because the head bolts go into the water jackets. So if you got a 50-year-old engine, there's a pretty good chance there's a lot of rust on the threads and rust on the bolts. And it's very important. I made 2 videos now on the importance of fasteners, how to use a fastener. And one of the important things is we're going to use all the original fasteners that this engine came with 50 years ago. That's going to be just fine. Not a problem. But you still have to pay attention to what you're doing. And one of the things is, as I mentioned in that video, 50% of all the torque that you apply when you torque anything goes into friction. So you want to make sure you minimize that friction as much as you can. So in the case of the head bolts, there's 17 on each side. I don't have it. Mike actually took them home to clean them up. So the trick is, not a trick, everyone's got to go on a rotary wire brush, powered wire brush wheel that will clean them immaculately. They have to be cleaned. And the next thing I do is make sure the threads in the block, I got one to demonstrate, are properly prepared. So in advance of doing that, I put some of this stuff in there. This is just penetrating oil. It's great for removing rust. I let it sit there for a while. And then we take a head bolt, not the one you're going to use in the job, if you can, but if you don't have one. And so I take this tool, and I brought this out just to make sure, don't use this tool to do that. Anything but take things apart. It can get you in a lot of trouble. It's got a lot of torque, and it's not for jobs like this. This little nut runner is less than 20 foot-pounds of torque on it. It's a nut runner. It's not a torque wrench. But I go back and forth here. You can see me demonstrating. Okay, going the wrong way. I got a dead battery in my... Hang on, we'll change it, won't take long. See that? Things always go wrong when you're on the camera. Okay.
That's okay. That's part of the job.
So, going in. So you keep doing that. Back and forth until you're sure that you got nice, clean threads on these bolts, because when you torque them, you want as much of the torque to go into stretching that bolt and not into friction. One of the problems with small block Chevs, once again, is the bolts go into water. So this is what I use to seal them. It's a Permatex product, and it works pretty good. And you have to put that on all the bolts, on all the threads, and even under the head, because water can find its way up and leak out the head if it isn't sealed properly. So that gets liberally included. But before installing that, brake clean, blow all the holes with hair. For those products to work, it has to be dry. The surface has to be dry. You don't want any penetrating oil on it. So that's the product I use to do that. So I got that out of the way. So I covered off the threads. Okay, let's turn the engine upside down. I'm going to show you what's going on the bottom of it. So now that we did that, and I'm going to come back, we're going to also check the clearance on the rod bearing with the dial bore gauge. And I've actually showed this on previous videos, but if you're watching this video for the purpose of doing this one, then it's going to be more helpful to you. So the crankshaft's in. I had to keep moving, but I'm going to show the same procedure for checking a rod bearing as I used to check the main bearings. Come out really nice, 2 to 2.2 thou on every rod bearing, and very, very precise, and that's plenty. The OEM range is actually less than a thou minimum, and typically people talk about for every inch of diameter you want an inch of clearance. That's not a bad rule of thumb, but don't get hung up on it. 2.2 thou, actually the crank is 2.45, and that's close enough. Like, don't get excited. There's lots of LEDs that ran around in 1969 that came from GM with a thousandths of an inch clearance on the main bearings, and they ran just fine. So, but 2.2 thou is really nice. And then you check and make sure as you're tightening it, it spins nicely. Now in this case, I got lots of assembly lube in here, and this is the stuff, but there's a whole bunch of guys that make assembly lube. It all works fine. It's basically just thick oil that sticks. Stays on the crankshaft for you for a long time, but it's all prepared with assembly lube. When the main bearings are going in, one of the important points is make sure the caps fit nicely in the registers. There's a little slot there where the main bearing cap fits in. Sometimes you have to actually give it a little tap with a rubber hammer to get it to go down. That's okay, as long as it's not loose and sloppy. That's important. This is a 4-bolt main, so these are 70 foot-pounds on the inner bolts and 65 on the outers, okay? Then one of the things that you do is you give it a whack at both ends with a rubber hammer to set your thrust bearing, and then just use a screwdriver or something, I haven't got it here, to move the crankshaft back and forth, and you check the clearance right in here, and it only has to be about 3/1000ths of an inch is sufficient. I think it's 3 to 8 or 9, something like that. Just to make sure that your thrust bearing is not tight. If it is, it's going to get hot and burn up, and you're going to have a bad start to your project. One of the other things, when you put your oil pump on, make sure you use the right bolt. What's happened in the past, sometimes, I know this has happened, that's never happened to me fortunately, is by using the wrong bolt. If you turn this bolt in too far, you're trying to crush your main bearing, your rear main bearing, and that's going to cause all kinds of havoc. So you don't want to do that. Make sure if you don't have the original oil pump bolt, then you need to measure to make sure that's not going to happen. So you measure the distance when it's torqued, and you measure the distance that you got to go, and make sure that you never get into that point. I made a point in the last video about using this Velcro seal, BS11A29. And there's going to be a screenshot. I got the main bearing cap on now, so you can't see it. But I got a nice screenshot showing how it works. Every old crankshaft from any engine, probably not just the Chevrolet small block, but a big block, whatever. Over time, the rear main oil seal will wear a little notch into the crankshaft. And if you put a standard oil seal, the lip of the seal is going to fit right in that groove, and it's going to leak. The screenshot will tell the story. We're going to put that up, and the lip of the seal is moved over so that the contact point is not where that groove is. And that's the only way to fix that. You can't turn it down because there's no undersized seals. And if you had to weld it up to get that, restore that, you'd spend more than the crankshaft's worth. So that's the solution for that. And typically, if you do that, you're not going to get a leak. One of the main things we talk about is saving money. And so one of the things that you can do to save money is reuse as many parts as you can. And there's a convention of thinking that you take it apart, you just throw away everything and replace it. Well, here's an example. This engine has been rebuilt before, we can tell, because the crankshaft's ground 20 thou. The bore is still standard, but the crankshaft's ground. That's the oil pump out of it. The pickup's already on it, okay? So don't throw it away. This is actually a melting high volume oil pump. Now, that's overkill. You do not need, you can see the 55 HV. Okay, if it's just 55, it's a standard pump. If it's a 55 HV, it's a high volume. And it's okay, we're going to use it, but if I was buying one, I would just buy a standard pump. You do not need a high volume pump, honest, unless you got something crazy going on with your motor. And the bigger the pump is, basically it creates more volume. The gears are about 25% deeper than the gears on a standard pump. So in this case, we cleaned it up. You take the cover off, you can see the two gears. An oil pump is a positive displacement pump. When the gears turn, oil has to move or something's going to break. So unless those gears are all scratched up, or something wrong with them, or the grooves are worn, that would only be because somebody ran it with really dirty oil or shrapnel in it or something. And then this face, it's bolted together. Mike already did all this. And if you look at the face, if it's all scratched up badly, oil pressure will actually return from one side to the other and you won't have good oil pressure. I saw this engine run before we took it apart, so I know the oil pressure was good. I checked that, and so we don't have any worries. The other thing is to make sure the pressure relief valve is not stuck. There's a little pin in there that holds the spring. You can put different springs in to get, if you want higher pressure or lower pressure, and there's a color coding for that, but we're happy with the standard. It had good oil pressure the way it was. As long as that plunger is moving nicely, then we're going to be good. And once again, this engine is going to be started on my test stand. We're going to know all that. And I saw this pump run. It turns nice. There's no issues. There's no reason to throw this away. So one other thing we're doing to save money. So on threads, gotta wipe my hands here. On threads, back to threads a little bit, because someone mentioned, and I just thought about it, I better cover this off. One of the ways that people do, and there's nothing really wrong with that, is use a tap to do what I just did with the bolt. And you can do that. Be careful. If you're not careful, you can make that thread sloppier. You don't want to be doing that. So I like this method. Now, once in a while, I'll find one that's tight, and because it's rusty or whatever, there's still goop down in there from when it was sealed last, and I will get the tap out. There's also different kinds of taps. There's nut runners, and there's different types of taps. You do not want to be trying to tap a new hole. You're just cleaning the oil, or cleaning the rust or whatever out of that hole for yourself, so that when you torque the bolts, the torque goes into holding the head down and not into friction. Okay, so I think I'm going to move on and show you how I didn't get to do this with the, by the way, somebody brought up in one of my previous videos about turning the crankshaft. I didn't, and when I was at the dyno about a month ago, I forgot to bring this tool, so I tried to cheat and turn the crankshaft by just tightening the bolt, and somebody called me on it. So that's the tool to use. They're not expensive. When you're putting the engine together and it doesn't have a pulley on it, it's got a keyway in it. You put that in there, you use your ordinary wrench, and you can turn the crankshaft nicely. So let's flip it upside down. I'm going to go through the procedure for checking a clearance on a rod bearing. Okay, so make sure it doesn't flip on us. Once again, instead of going through all the pains of every little detail, I think I can show you the highlights. So, number one cylinder, This is piston number 1. A couple things that I do. I use a rod vise when you're torquing and untorquing the rods. This sits in there. The rod sits in like so, and it's a lot nicer way to torque it and keep your rod from getting any stress on it. If you don't have one of these, just be careful you don't distort your rod when you're doing it. I'm not around to doing the rings. I have already checked the piston clearance, but I'm not around to doing the rings. But one of the things that I do is, might make it faster, where do all the rings go? So before I start, I do this with every piston. It just takes a minute to do it. So I know when I'm going to put it together, where to put all the rings. So 1 is the top compression ring, 2 is the bottom compression ring. The oil rail goes anywhere in this quadrant here, and the top oil expander ring, the main oil ring, the expander, sorry, with the all the little grooves on it goes in here, any place in this range, and then the 2 spacer rings go here and here. So when I'm putting the rings on, I don't have to be looking and orientating where the piston is, whatever. The top gap always goes to the passenger side. The top ring, sorry, the gap in the top ring goes to the passenger side. The gap in the second ring goes to the driver's side. If you remember that. Now, if you don't get all that perfect, don't worry about it, because it's not critical, but you really want to make sure you don't have your ring grooves, your ring gaps in line with each other, because if you do, you're going to have more blow-by. Ideally, in operation, the rings actually rotate in the bore, so hopefully that's going to happen. But as you see, we're using Mike's original pistons. They are a forged piston, and they're going to give them about 10-to-1 compression ratio. Originally, we were going to replace the pistons, and now we decided to use them. So how do we determine the clearance? And this is the same procedure I use for the mains. So if you go back, number 1 is I take a micrometer, I measure the size of the bearing, I write that down, and it was, this crankshaft been turned 20 thou, 2.0805, okay? So 2.100 is standard, but once again, this crank's been turned 20 thou. So it's 2.080, which is 20 thou less, plus a half a thou, 5/10 of a thou. So then I put this, now what the dimension is, I do write it down and record it, and in future videos we'll actually put all this information on an Excel spreadsheet and make a screenshot of it, and so all that information will be available to anybody. But so I do record that, and then I put my dial bore gauge into this upside down. There we go. Zero my dial bore gauge. So if I get fumbling around here a little bit, there we go. See the 0? Okay. Be very careful when you put it down, you don't change the setting. It'd be helpful if I had 2 vices, but I don't. But we'll just mock this up for you. For checking that, I can't really use my rod vise for that. Take the same gauge, I just know it's zeroed on the size of the crankshaft. So when I put it in here and rotate it, it's now, if you look closely, 2/1000 of an inch. Where am I here? There we go, which is a nice number. Normally, thou per inch of diameter is preferred. Once again, don't get hung up on that. It doesn't have to be right on, it can be right down. If this was, I wouldn't put it together if it was less than 1.5 thou, to be fair, or more than 2.5 thou. I'd like to be in that range, though 2 is a really nice number. And on the mains, there's actually 2.2 thou on the mains. So both numbers are pretty good, so I'm happy with that. I've only checked this one. One of the advantages of DIY, when I do this, it takes me 80 to 100 hours to build a motor. But if you do it yourself, it doesn't matter how long it takes, right? So if you're a production shop, you can be sure if somebody's paying $100 an hour plus tax, whatever, to do this kind of work, that they're not doing that with every bearing and recording it and recording the clearance. They grind the crankshaft, they know they took 20 thou off, they put the bearings in, if the crank turns, that's all they need to know. But if you do it yourself, you can make sure that you don't have that. You can check every single, which I do, check every single bore, every single journal, and I will know exactly the clearance on every single journal in the entire engine. So, and that gives you a sleep at night, a good sleep at night feeling, because you don't want to be worried about that when you fire it up. We're going to have two instances of that. We're going to fire it up on my test stand, and then a week from this Saturday, we're going to put it on the dyno and see how it runs. So I tried to cover up a whole bunch of stuff. I think I got most of the points. If I didn't get them on this clip, we'll do it on the next clip. And I didn't get to say like or subscribe. Should have got that in early. That's really important. Subscribers are what keeps me going. And without subscribers, there wouldn't be any YouTube. So that's not just for me, but for everybody else. If you give me a like, then YouTube might show it to somebody else and they might subscribe. So that's how it helps. So if you like this kind of information, we're trying to give you information so you can do this yourself. Hope that helps. And guys, hope you guys have a good day. And thank you for watching Gold's Garage.